Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Susan Kaufman. I'm here for Attitude Magazine's weekly ADHD Experts broadcast. Our speaker today is renowned author and expert Dr. Peg Dawson, who will give us an overview on how the teen years present unique challenges to all of us, and especially for parents of teens with ADHD. So Dr. Dawson is going to be providing us a guide to boosting executive functions and building independence in your teen. And some of the topics that she'll be talking about today are why specifically adolescence is especially challenging for the student with ADHD or LD, how we as parents can understand the developmental tasks of adolescence and what they mean for us as parents in the parent-child relationship, how we can stay connected with our teens as they strive to become more independent, and how we can protect them as we want to from the risks out there without being intrusive, and just overall strategies that parents can use to help their teens transition to adulthood successfully, which is, I think, all of our goal. Let me introduce you to Peg Dawson, who has been a popular speaker at Attitude many times in the past, as well as an author on our website. She is just a font of practical information. She is a PhD in education. She received her doctorate in school and child clinical psychology from the University of Virginia and has worked with children and young adults for over 30 years, first as a school psychologist in Maine and New Hampshire, and for the last 20 years at the Center for Learning and Attention Disorders in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where she specializes in the assessment of children and adults with learning and attention disorders. She is the co-author of two books that we love at Attitude about improving executive function skills. One is called Smart But Scattered, and the second one is called Smart But Scattered Teens. So look for those books and look for her articles on attitudemag.com. Thank you so much, Peg, for joining us today, as always. I would also like to thank the sponsor of today's webinar. We could not do our webinars without and provide all this great information absolutely at no cost to our listeners without our sponsors. And Play Attention is a sponsor of this webinar and others in the past, a really terrific comprehensive program. It's available for both children and adults to strengthen executive functions and self-regulation, all the functions that are essential for controlling reason, emotions, and actions for success in life. Play Attention is www.playattention.com. You can check out their website. You can call 1-800-788-6786 and learn how Play Attention can be customized for you or for your child, and even provide a personal executive function coach. Play Attention is offering Attitude webinar participants a special discount. It's a $200 discount, pretty significant, with code ADDWEB. So check out playattention.com, and thank you to Play Attention. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Dawson with our thanks, as always, for being here today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to start with a slide that includes a quote from a Parade magazine article that came out a few years ago that was on the topic of the teenage brain. The teenage brain is like a Ferrari. It's sleek, shiny, sexy, and fast, and it corners really well, but it also has really crappy brakes, which I think really sort of captures the challenge of both adolescence and being the parent of an adolescent, is try to figure out how to help our kids navigate that very fast car while being aware that if they drive it too fast or too carelessly, they're in trouble. So I'm going to start by, and I should say, our model of executive skills, if people are familiar with our work, we talk about 11 different executive skills which factor in, that we think really contribute to school success. And that's really where we started from, is thinking about school success. I'm going to focus on four, I think it's four skills in particular that really play a role in the parent-child relationship. So although that's what I'm going to be addressing more than others, if people have questions about school performance, again, during the question and answer period, I'd be happy to address those as well. So let's start by thinking about what executive skills are. Okay, they're a set of brain-based functions. They're managed out of the frontal lobes of the brain, which is the part of the brain right behind the forehead. And they help teens to regulate their behavior, to set goals and achieve them, to balance wants and desires with needs and responsibilities, and to balance the desire for independence with the need for guidance. And just to quickly dive into what the neuroscience behind this, what this research tells us that the teen brain is primed for the acquisition of new skills. So that's what the brain is ready to do at that age. They're also driven to explore new experiences and more intense social and emotional relationships. And they're driven, for better or worse, to take new risks. So when we look at, for instance, how drawn kids are to taking risks, or how people are drawn to taking risks, what we find is that people are more drawn to taking risks during adolescence than any other time during the developmental period. I mean, if you ask a 10, 11-year-old about risky behavior, they're actually pretty cautious. And sometime in the next couple of years, they're going to throw caution to the winds, and suddenly everything looks exciting. So that's our challenge as parents. And I should mention also, I guess this didn't get it put in the introduction, I have 2 adult sons. They're now in their 30s, but I have fairly vivid memories of what it was like to be a parent of teenagers. So that informs my work as well. Okay, so let's think about it. Even teens with good executive skills struggle at times with behavior governed by these skills because they're not as yet securely developed. These skills, by the way, and you may well know this, take 25 years to reach full maturation, and that's in typically developing kids. With kids with ADHD, there is a developmental lag. In fact, Russ Barkley's often talked about a 30% developmental lag between executive skills in typically developing kids and in kids with ADHD. The result, though, with teenagers in general is that there's this Jekyll and Hyde-like behavior. 1 minute they're cool, calm, and rational. We call that cool cognition. The next minute they're screaming, emotional, and irrational. We call that hot cognition. And part of this is due to changes in the way neurotransmitters function in the brain during adolescence, and these have a huge impact on our behavior. So the dopamine system, that's the neurotransmitter that manages the frontal lobes, and we know in general that kids with ADHD release dopamine at a lower rate, but it becomes more unpredictable in adolescence. So there's a change in the distribution of dopamine that plays a role in the emotional response and the ability to experience pleasure and pain. These changes in dopamine levels result in mood changes, difficulty with emotional control, increased sensation seeking, and risk taking. I've heard some experts on the brain in teenagers talk about what people are looking for at that age is they're looking for dopamine hits, and risk and excitement give them dopamine hits. But there are differences in the serotonin, which is the second neurotransmitter. There's a decrease in serotonin, which plays a role in mood fluctuations, anxiety, impulse control, and arousal levels. So with decreased serotonin, there may be results in decreased impulse control. But again, keep in mind with kids with ADHD, some of these systems may be different because of the nature of their attention disorder. So, and also factor in the behavioral effects of an evolving relationship between the limbic system, which is the part of the neural system that manages emotions, and an immature prefrontal cortex. So teenagers tend to rely more on the emotional brain, which results in quickness to anger, intense mood swings, and decision-making based on gut feelings. Therefore, they have increased hot cognition versus cold cognition. So more often than not, they are trying to think under conditions of high arousal and intense emotions, which this isn't just true of teenagers, but we all don't do our best thinking in those circumstances. So how do executive skills develop? And this is true not just of executive skills, but of all skills. All skills develop through a process called myelination. And myelin is a fatty sheath that wraps itself around nerve cells. What you have there on that slide is an electron microscope picture of a nerve cell. So the dark part in the center, that's the nerve cell. The lighter part around it is the myelin. And each time the same nerve cell fires, a little more myelin builds up. And if we're practicing the same behaviors over and over again, the same nerve cells are firing. So the myelin is getting thicker and thicker. And it ends up acting just like insulation on an electric cord. So the thicker the myelin, the faster the impulse travels. The faster the impulse travels, the better the skill. So we're working towards automaticity. All skills, including executive skills, improve with practice because of that the speed with which the myelination enables the impulses to travel much faster. And that's basically skill development, is being able to respond quickly. So here are the 4 executive skills that have the greatest impact on behavior and risk taking, and those are the ones I'm going to focus on primarily today. And the first one, response inhibition, is, of all the executive skills out there, this one is pretty involved in an attention disorder. So most kids with ADD tend to have reduced response inhibition. So if we think of response inhibition as the capacity to think before you act, or and to resist the urge to say or do something, this tends to be lower in kids with ADHD. Now, it may be worse in kids with the predominantly hyperactive impulsive type of ADHD, but we also see this as being somewhat diminished in kids, even with the inattentive type of ADHD, in part because they have trouble ignoring distractions. They are drawn to whatever, the shiny object is at this point in time. And again, that's true both of the hyperactive and the inattentive types of ADHD kids. Emotional control is another executive skill that certainly impacts behavior and risk taking. This is the ability to manage your emotions. And this becomes, even if kids when they're younger are fairly good at managing their emotions, because of those other brain changes in adolescence, they may lose control more easily at that age level. The next one is flexibility, the ability to revise plans in the face of obstacles, setbacks, new information, or mistakes. It relates to an adaptability to changing conditions. In my work with executive skills, and both kids and adults with ADHD, I often find that flexibility is a strength for these kids, right? They are, and adults for that matter, they are go-with-the-flow kinds of kids. But obviously, flexibility can impact how we make decisions as well. And then finally, metacognition, which is the ability to stand back and see the big picture, to be able to see oneself in a situation and understand all the variables that are impacting us in our behavior and the situation itself. There's a self-awareness component to it. Sometimes we talk about self-monitoring and self-evaluative skills. This, in the scheme that my colleague, Dr. Guerra, and I developed, this is the last executive skill to emerge. And in fact, I would say with the typical kid, maybe 5th grade, you see some glimmers of metacognition, but it's very slow developing. And so when we ask kids, why did you do that? And they say they don't know, chances are they don't know because they don't have the metacognitive skills to evaluate what just happened. 2 other brain changes. We'll move on beyond the brain pretty soon, but I do want to sort of give you that picture. 2 other brain changes that enable the brain to improve its ability to handle complexity in adolescence. One is called pruning. Pruning is a discarding of unused nerve cells. So we have all these neural connections. That's how the brain communicates with each other. And we have very few at birth, and then they proliferate incredibly rapidly. Starting from shortly after birth, we have about 700 new synaptic or neural connections per second growing. Obviously, that can't go on forever. So eventually, we discard the ones that aren't used. And in fact, that's how the decision is made. Which neural networks do we retain and which do we discard? We discard the ones we're not using. So think of how teenagers are spending their time. I mean, if they're spending hours and hours playing video games, those neural connections are not getting discarded. But if they're things like, say deep reading comprehension activities, it's not, if they're not doing a whole lot of that, it's not that they lose the ability to do that, but this is really the ideal time to work on those skills. And so pruning sort of works from 2 angles, because once we discard excess nerve cells, the ones that remain work way better. That's why we have increases in connectivity between different brain regions. So we can transmit the information more rapidly. We connect with more distant regions of the brain, and we connect with them more efficiently. And so in a way, if you think about what metacognition is, both figuratively and literally, it's about making connections. And so that improves with adolescence. So with that as background and giving the complexity of what's going on in the brains of teenagers and teenagers with ADHD, what tools do parents have available to them to help their teenagers sort of navigate adolescence? I'm going to focus particularly on communication and motivation. I guess the other 2, negotiation, collaborative problem solving, you'll hear that sort of weaving through here, because what we've found is that when parents are willing to engage in a collaborative relationship where it's not always a top-down hierarchical, you're going to do this because I tell you to do this, but more of an approach that says, okay, let's put our heads together. We got a problem here. Here's what it looks like from my perspective. You tell me what it looks like from your perspective. Kids seem to really respond to, at least in conversation, being treated as another adult. Yeah, ultimately parents make decisions and they need to make decisions. But leading up to that decision, if we can treat the kid as an adult in terms of their what they bring to the discussion, I think that helps. So these look fairly straightforward. I think this is originally from what's his name, Robbins' book on adolescent development or ADHD in adolescence. And he just has this really nice list of here's what you don't do, here's what you do. You know, you don't use insults, you state the issue. You don't interrupt, you take turns. You don't criticize, you note the good and the bad without, just say, here's what I observe, without criticizing. You don't get defensive, you calmly disagree. You don't give lectures. If you talk for too long, kids will stop listening. You know that. Say it short and straight. You don't get distracted. You pay attention. You don't use sarcasm. You talk in a normal tone. You don't go silent. Some parents do that. They just stop talking. You say what you feel. You don't yell. You accept responsibility. You don't swear. You use respectful but emphatic language. Now, again, all of that is easier said than done, as I'm sure you know. But I would almost, I think if I were going back and reliving my adolescence with my kid, I probably would have posted that on the wall, because that's actually good advice, not just for parents, but also for kids, because kids do all those things. They may be less likely to lecture their parents, but all those other ones get wrapped in there with how teenagers behave as well. Couple of other principles of communication: be available to talk when the teen is ready, or offer a specific time. In the heat of a meltdown is probably not the best time to carry on a conversation. I just remember, again, you probably had this experience too, when my kids were teenagers, there was something almost magical about driving in the car. And having the conversations we could have driving in the car, especially after dark for some reason. Like if I pick up my kid from a school event that ended in the evening, just being enveloped by darkness, no eye contact required. It seemed like that was the best time to ask my kid, so what do you think about, or remember what happened yesterday? What do you think was going on there? And using active listening, which means you're not just listening, but you're paraphrasing and saying, so here's what I think you just said. You tell me if I heard that right. That's sort of active listening. Negotiate whenever possible. For one thing, it teaches kids how to negotiate, which is a really good skill to have, and something which it appears that a lot of people don't have anymore. And then avoid the knee-jerk no. I would also, it's funny, some of these slides were prepared by my colleague, Dr. Guerre, and the knee-jerk no is good advice, but the opposite also should be avoided, because I think there are parents out there who give in too quickly to their kids. So maybe the knee-jerk yes should be avoided as well. I'll just throw that out there. If people want to respond to that, that's fine. So those are general communication strategies. Let's think about what motivates teens. This is a list. Again, it was created by my colleague, and I think he did a really nice job of thinking about getting inside the heads of teens and thinking, what do they want? And it's not just they want, the latest version of the smartphone or an upgraded video game system. But these are, if you watch their behavior and if you can get in those conversations, this is what they're looking for. They want to have the chance to do what adults do. I mean, they're just impatient to grow up to have all the freedom that adults have. And so when they have that opportunity, when you can responsibly give them the chance to do what adults do, that's motivating to them. They're motivated by being able to make their own choices and decisions. You can't always allow them to do that, but again, I'll get to this later in terms of how do you give kids choices and how do you handle it when you can't give them what they want. They value having their opinions valued. I think we all feel that way, and so why should teens be any different? And then finally, they like to decide what rules will apply and how. Again, you can look at all of those and think, I can't let my kid do any of those. But if this is a starting point, this is what motivates them. And then you can say, okay, so how can I take these motivators and have them fit my kid? Okay, so now I'm going to go through the 4 executive skills I talked about earlier, just some tips for managing specific executive skill challenges. I'm going to run through these really quickly because I'm checking the time here and I realize we have 8 minutes left. So, and actually they're fairly self-explanatory unless people have specific questions, which we can get to. So with response inhibition, I think number 1, assume that in the presence of peers, your teen will have reduced impulse control. I mean, we know from the research that teens in the company of other teenagers are more likely to engage in risky behavior than if they're by themselves, which is why most states have graduated license laws now. New Hampshire, which is where I live, the first 6 or 9 months after you get your driver's license at 16, you cannot drive alone with a friend in the car. You can drive alone or with an adult, but not with a friend because of that. Expect your teen to choose fun activities over challenging or less pleasurable ones. I don't know how many parents I've had in my office saying, doesn't my kid realize that how he's behaving now is going to affect what college he gets into in 3, 4, however many years. That's thinking from an adult perspective. Kids can't project into the future the way adults can. In fact, there's a concept called future orientation, which I think it's really important to understand. Kids do not, and it's a cognitive truth that kids don't perceive the future the way adults do. And so when you say 4 years from now, what's going to happen, they can't perceive of that. I've also discovered from years of working with parents and adults is that once parents get that future orientation, they forget what it's like not to have that. So they can't remember what it was like to be 14 and be governed by the pimple that's on our nose that's going to make us feel really self-conscious when we go to school the next day. To help your teen delay gratification, use waiting periods for things she wants to do or have. Having kids wait, that's basically how you teach response inhibition. This will probably date me. I mean, I'm 68 years old, but I remember when I was in 8th grade, which was when kids started getting pierced ears, I desperately wanted my ears pierced. And my father, who was an oceanographer and had this image of street urchins on the streets of Lisbon, Portugal, when he thought about girls with pierced ears, he didn't reject it out of hand, but he told me, in January, my birthday was in September, he said, if you still want to get your ears pierced in September, then we'll consider it. And so there I was having to wait 9 months, which was very wise on his part, I think. I still got my ears pierced, but I think it was still wise for him to have me wait. Require your teen to earn some of the things he wants is another way to teach delayed gratification and response inhibition. So kids can do chores and earn points that can be traded in for either tangible reinforcers or access to the things they already have, video games, time with friends or whatever. Prepare your teen for situations that require impulse control by regularly reviewing the rules in advance. So if you've got a trouble spot that your kid tends to be impulsive in, reviewing in advance. Okay, so how are you going to handle it if this happens? And again, immediately before your teen goes into a situation that may test response inhibition, review the specific rules again. Your kid may roll his eyes and repeat verbatim whatever the rule is, but at least they've heard the rule and they may call it up at a time when they need it. Okay, moving on to emotional control. Be clear and specific about your rules and keep the have-tos to a relatively small number. That means don't go overboard in the number of rules you're imposing on your kid, but try to pare it down. And in fact, those of you who tune into Ross Green's presentation later on in this series, he does a really nice job of talking about that as well. So his presentation will probably be a really nice follow-up to this one. Be sure your teen knows about appointments, family gatherings, and other events not scheduled by the teen for fun so that there are no surprises. If there are family obligations, let your kid know in advance. And you may need to remind him because he may not have been listening the first time you told him. And you may want to post it visually. I'd have a giant calendar if there are a lot of family obligations that the kid needs to be involved with, just so he can check the calendar, frequently. Use communication strategies that invite discussion rather than confrontation, and we went through those before. Okay, moving on to flexibility. Whenever possible, provide advance notice or a warning for what's coming next, especially if it does not conform to the teen's expectations. Try to maintain schedules and routines whenever possible so that there's some predictability to the kid's life. Whenever possible, help your teen anticipate what she might encounter in a situation and help her develop a script for it. That one and the next one, walk your teen through the newer anxiety-producing situations. That rehearsal is not just great for kids who might lose it because they're upset or angry or frustrated, but that rehearsal in advance is also really helpful for kids with anxiety. So you can talk through, what do you think might happen, or if this happens, what might you say to yourself? Because just having a script again provides a reassurance to kids for whom anxiety is an issue. For recurring situations or expectations such as sleepovers and curfew, be clear and specific about any non-negotiable rules. And yes, there is a place for non-negotiable rules in all of this. In situations where your teen wants something from you, I love this. This is Dick's idea. Remember that your maybe becomes his yes. As soon as you say maybe, he hears yes. And so keep that in mind. Assume that when your teen comes to you with a question or proposal about some activity she would like to do, in her mind, she's committed to the activity happening. This is a variation on the one we just said. A kid gets an idea in her head. She's already walked it through and see how it's going to work even before she comes to you and asks your permission. So you sort of have to undo that carefully because she will not be happy. And then be judicious in your use of the word no. Okay, and then finally, metacognition. And again, this is the last skill to develop, so you may have to do trial and error with this to see if your kid is ready for this kind of thinking. But one thing, start with specific praise for key elements of task performance by recognizing strategies that your teen uses. And if you can't figure out what strategy they used, you may want to ask them about it. Man, you didn't lose your cool when your little brother was all over you. What were you doing to maintain your cool? Did you say something to yourself? I've started asking kids that. Were you saying something to yourself? Because everybody talks to themselves. And sometimes that's the key to finding out what strategy the kid used. If you make it too open-ended a question, how did you keep your temper? They may not be able to answer that. But if you say, what did you say to yourself? Encourage your teen to evaluate her own performance on a task or in a social situation. And again, not in the heat of the moment, not when the kid is devastated by what just happened, but maybe the next day or a couple of days later. And if the kid brings it up, all the better, because then you can sort of tiptoe through the kinds of questions you'd like her to think about. Encourage the teen to ask for performance evaluations as a way to improve his performance. If you can get a kid to do this, if you can get a kid to go to his teacher and say, I was not expecting that grade. I thought I was going to get a higher grade on that test. Can you give me some specifics about what I might have done differently? Again, that's a hard sell because that means the kid has to be vulnerable. But if you can let the kid know that is, that will endear that kid to any employer he ever has if he goes to the employer and say, what could I be doing better or differently? So it's job security. Use your behavior as a way of indirectly helping your teen understand how people might react to her behavior. So you might say, when you talk like that, here's how it affected me. Here's how I felt about it. And then finally, in situations where your interaction with the teen is a source of conflict and you feel that he is reacting to a behavior that you both bring to the situation, such as an angry tone of voice, go to your teen at a neutral time and talk about your behavior and your reaction to the situation. So use I messages, in other words. Okay, I think I am out of time. I guess let me just go through this one last one. I forget whether there are more after this or not. Because I think, although we've talked about those 5 executive skills, the other huge executive skill that parents are concerned about with teenagers is goal-directed persistence. That ability to set a goal and stick with it long enough to achieve it. And I know there are a lot of parents out there who are frustrated that their kids don't seem to be doing that. That's because they're stuck in the present. They don't have that future orientation. And so what I often tell parents, because this is what I discovered with my own kids, I was modeling goal-directed persistence, and my husband was. They saw this every day throughout their childhood. They saw both of us working hard for goals that mattered to us. When in their early adolescence, that wasn't enough to affect their behavior then, but I will tell you, again, they're both in their mid to late 30s and very successful adults. That was what kicked in once they got to a point where they actually could conceive of the future and figure out how to get what they wanted. Okay, let me start there because I'm a little over the time, and there are probably some questions and answers out there. Or there's some questions anyway. I don't know if there are answers.
Dr. Dawson, thank you so much. To the listeners, could you post us questions and tell us what specific executive function problem you have in your household that you'd like Dr. Dawson to address, and the age of your child? That would be really helpful, and then we'll have an overview of the kinds of issues that prompted you to attend this webinar. So first of all, someone says, is there an assessment for my child's executive function? It's an interesting question because you and I were just talking about that.
Right.
We do have a bit of a quiz, a self-test on the Attitude website. And I think Dr. Dawson also has one. Do you not?
Yeah, but go to the Attitude website first because that's probably a good place to start. In our books, just about all of them, but Smart but Scattered Teens might be a place to start. We have an executive skills questionnaire. In fact, we suggest that we have an adult version, or a parent version, and a teen version. Actually, we have 3 versions because there's one where the parent can assess their own executive skills. And then there's one where the parent can assess the kid's executive skills. And then there's one where the kid can assess their own executive skills. And so actually one of the things we suggest is the parent and the kid both fill it out on the kid and then compare notes and to see the extent to which they agree or disagree with their perceptions. What I've found over the years of using any executive skills questionnaire, my own or published versions, is that kids tend to downplay the problems. They don't see them as pronounced as their parents see them. But that's a good conversation starter, as long as it doesn't become blaming the kid. But anyway, it's a good conversation starter.
Okay. Interesting set of questions here, set of problems here. So a number of people listening in seem to have kids who are oppositional. So one person says how to handle mouthing off or arguing, even if I walk away. And other people say similar things. So my child's room is a disaster. When I ask her about school assignments, she tells me it's none of my business. And another person goes so far as to say, what do I do when my child spits in my face? So, I mean, maybe this kind of oppositional behavior is outside the norm, Peg, I don't know, of executive function. Here's another one. My teenager is very angry all the time, especially about schoolwork. When asked to do simple things, she lashes out with rage and violence. Any thought? So that seems to be something that prompts a number of the people who are listening in to be here today.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, and again, people probably, there's a continuum here. And right. One question I would have is, at what point does it become towards the more severe end of the continuum where my answering your advice is not going to do it? Yeah. So I would say, I mean, in terms of making that decision, the frequency, the duration, and the severity. So if the spitting happens once and the kid lost his temper, that's one thing. But if that happens or variations on that kind of behavior happens frequently, then I would probably be looking for outside help from a therapist. And I think about therapy with teenagers is they end up acting as outside mediators. They listen to the kid's point of view, they listen to the parent's point of view, and they try to find common ground, and they act as sort of a buffer on both sides. And so, I mean, finding the right therapist may be challenging, but I do think if the behaviors that you all have described are happening very frequently with a higher degree of severity than you think is typical of a teenager, or they last longer than a typical teenager, then I would start looking for help. Yeah. And I guess the other thing is, again, how to confront this, obviously not in the heat of the moment, but I would suggest that you sit back and come up in your own head with a game plan of how you're going to handle it. I mean, you may have some rules. So, and just letting the kid know in advance, when you swear at me, here's what I'm going to do. Mm-hmm. And then even better would be to sit down and have both sides talk about, when you do this, this is how I react, and it doesn't make me feel good. I must do some things that don't make you feel good. Let's see if we can put those on the table and come up with, a way to handle it that doesn't involve either of us doing those things, that leaves neither of us feeling good.
Right. Yeah, I want to just reinforce what you said about seeking out outside help, because some of the, violent responses are not possibly in the realm of classic ADHD, or they may be beyond that, right? I mean, yeah.
Right,
Okay.
absolutely.
Yeah. Then dialing all the way back. So lots of questions about the classic sort of, how do I get my kid to be organized with their schoolwork? One person says, my son's 14, seems to have no sense of time or urgency about paying attention to his grades. My child, another one, 15, has a really difficult time working through a lot amount of homework, to the point that frustration and being overwhelmed just takes over, completely shuts down. And then, my kid can't find his basic schoolwork. So a number of questions about organization and motivation around school coming in.
Okay, so one thought I would have is that if there are 14-year-old boys in particular out there who care about their grades, I've never met them. I'm sure there are, but I had two sons one had ADHD. I forgot to mention that. And the other one was a pretty unmotivated kid. So both of them, I took different tacks with both of them to get them through high school, but at various points with either one of them, I felt like my job wasn't to bring them up to the highest possible level. My job was to keep their head above water so they didn't drown. And so, to be honest, I didn't give up on room cleaning, for instance, with my older son, who was a particularly messy kid, but I certainly put it on the back burner. And, maybe once every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I would say to him, okay, Aaron, it's time to clean the room. We gotta do this. And, he'd stuff stuff under the bed, and we'd joke about it, to get it out of sight. But I decided, and actually, here's some advice for people as well, because this worked really well for me. And we diagnosed my son's attention disorder when he was 14. And if I had filled out an executive skills questionnaire on him at that time, he would have had all kinds of problems. I knew I couldn't tackle all of them. So I basically said to myself, what do I want? I got 4 years. What do I want him to look like by the time he graduates from high school? And I boiled it down. I threw out room cleaning. I threw out a bunch of other stuff. I kept chores, because chores are important. But basically, I boiled it down to, okay, I think it's important for him to do his homework and to hand it in on time. And so that's what we focused on. And to be honest, I didn't feel like it was my job to judge the quality of the homework. The grades were going to do that. That was the teacher's job. And I settled for a kid who was a BC student when I knew he could have easily been an AB student. Because if I'd been pushing him to that, it would have undermined the relationship I had with him way more than it was undermined just by the fact that this is a parent with a teenager. And so, again, you pick your battles in terms of those things. You decide what's really important. It's funny, I always tell this story because Aaron had a really good friend named Jeff. And Jeff's mom probably went through the same process of deciding what was important. And sometime in 8th grade, Jeff learned that anything that was on his bedroom floor in the morning was donated to Goodwill by the afternoon. She took this very seriously. Jeff, as a consequence, was very neat. So, different parents will have different priorities. And I think there is, a place for imposing some of your priorities, but not to the point where you feel like it is totally undermining your long-term relationship with your child.
Well, I think the question of the long-term relationship is an important one. That's something certainly that many people are mentioning. So one person says, I have a 16-year-old who's a junior in high school. There's a long list of things he needs to do to be ready to apply to college. And none of these things make it to the top of his daily to-do list. Reviewing SAT, filling out the questionnaire, meeting with the school counselor. It takes everything he's got to do his homework every night, and he just runs out of time. I'm not sure, here's the key thing, how to support without nagging, taking over, causing conflict. I think there's the dilemma, right?
Right, exactly. The other, we talked about therapists before, but the things that people are raising now, you can't outsource everything, but I do think that's what executive skills coaches are for. And again, not everybody has the means to hire a coach, but sometimes you can access coaches through schools. Sometimes I had the mom of a kid, talk to the teenager next door about just sitting and doing their homework, the kid's homework with them, because their kid really looked up to that teenager. So it reduced some of the stress around nagging the kid around homework. But it also, because here's what has to happen. Parents have to go from micromanaging their kid, which is what we typically do throughout childhood, to when that kid goes to college, you're not going to be there to micromanage him. He has to get independent. And so how do you get him off of micromanaging to independence? And very often a coach is the midway point. The coach is the way station. And so if parents are willing to relinquish some of that micromanaging to a coach, the benefit of a coach is they don't have that personal relationship with the kid. They don't have their entire genetic history tied up in that kid, or the hopes and dreams for the future that every parent has. They have, in a way, if they're a good coach, they have a more clear-eyed view of the child, and they can help that kid set goals of their own. And sometimes kids set goals better with, again, someone outside the family, because they feel like if the parent is asking them to set a goal, there's a hidden agenda there. The parent wants the kid to set the goal that they want them to set.
And one thing, you probably have seen this, that I've seen that sometimes parents can hire another high school student. It doesn't necessarily have to be an expensive coach. It can just be almost someone to serve as a body double to sit with the child and just be, as you say, not the parent.
Right.
Yeah. So
in part because, all of those people don't have the same emotional investment. So they're not tapping into those hot cognitions, and that's what sends kids off. So it's much easier for a teenager from next door to say, so have you started your math yet? Or have you started studying for that social studies test? Because I know it's going to take a lot. I had that teacher a couple of years ago, and I know what kinds of tests he gives. So again, I agree with you.
Yeah. So here's a great one from Anne. This one I'm sure many people could have written. Mornings are terrible for us. We have a bedtime instituted for the household, but my son continues to stay up late, wake up late, not eat breakfast, forget his homework. We all leave for school and work in a bad mood every day. We've tried charts. We've tried rules. How do we handle this?
Yeah.
So mornings.
Yeah, this is tough. And I've got several responses to this. One is just recognizing, unfortunately, that the way most high schools operate today is not in line with the bodily changes that kids go through in adolescence. The typical teenage body wants to fall asleep at 11 o'clock at night. They still need 8 to 9 hours of sleep. So that means that even if you can get your kid in bed by 11, which is when his body wants to fall asleep, you're still probably depriving him at the other end of how much sleep he really needs. So I'll just throw this out there. If you can start working with school districts on delaying the school start time for high schools, it's a really tough sell, because it disrupts everybody's schedule. Boston just tried to do it, and the superintendent had to back down because parents complained about how it was going to change their schedules.
Oh, really? They tried to move the school day later, and parents complained?
Yep, parents complained. And so
they had to be at work, right?
Right. The superintendent had to back down, and I felt really bad about that. Minneapolis did it many years ago, somehow managed to do it successfully. So that's number one. And so just being honest with your kid, I know what's going on. Here's what we got to do. We got to plow through this. Definitely, I can't say this strongly enough, and I know how hard this is. There should not be technology in the bedroom when your kids go to bed. Mm-hmm. They should not have their phones with them. They should not have laptops or tablets or any of those things, because here's the other thing that's going on. The blue light in all of those screens disrupts the melatonin secretion process. Melatonin, that process is what enables your body to fall asleep. So if it's disrupting that process, what happens when you fall asleep is about an hour before you fall asleep, you have this suffusion, this melatonin suffuses your brain and shuts it down and you fall asleep. If you are on screens that are not switched so they're providing amber light, right? And you can do that. There are ways to do that. But you should never be on blue screens, for a couple of hours before bedtime. So that's number one. They should not be on phones in the middle of the night. All of that should be out of there. And then I just will throw this out because whenever I talk about it, people are always surprised. I told you I had two sons and they both struggled in school for different reasons. My younger son had a sleep disorder, and it was called delayed sleep phase syndrome. I told you the typical teenage body wants to fall asleep at 11. His body wanted to fall asleep at 2 in the morning.
Oh,
yeah, it was brutal. It was absolutely brutal. So, and the few times I managed to get him, because he was a computer geek, so he was on the computer all the time. And finally, I stay up and I say, Isaac, go to bed. You need to go to bed. And he'd tell me the next day, Mom, I was in bed by 11. I stared at the ceiling for 3 hours.
wow.
So that's when I realized something was going on. So if your child happens to fit that extreme, and you typically see it because they sleep, their preferred sleep, and you may see it during vacations, they'll stay up till 2 or 3 in the morning and they'll sleep through to noon, 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. If that's happening pretty consistently, if you try to get them to go to bed early and they can't fall asleep even though you've taken away all of their technology, if there's any history of that kind of sleep disorder in the family, if there are any night owls who seem like extreme night owls, that's probably something you should have checked out medically.
Okay. And I've also heard of sleep apnea sometimes with, high school kids being interpreted as ADHD when it's something else.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, a couple of people chimed in just to try to be helpful. And one person said, try a sunrise alarm clock. Another person said, for Anne, do everything you can the night before, backpacks, lunch, whatever you can. So
yes, good advice. Absolutely.
Surviving this is, yeah.
I've had parents who have their kids sleep in their school clothes so they don't have to get dressed in the morning.
Melatonin recommended by a number of people.
Yeah.
And someone else says, my daughter would run away if we took her phone away. So, yeah, I think there's a strong phone attachment for sure. Someone posted an interesting URL, sleepfoundation.org/sleep topics, sleep hygiene. So that's probably got some.
Excellent. Yes. Check that out.
That's great. And meditation is also recommended by people. Yeah. So interesting. Couple of people asking questions along these lines. Given my 16-year-old's problems with executive function, is it reasonable to expect him or her to go to college at 18? Someone else says, should we be looking at a gap year? I think that question of how are they going to make that transition from high school to college is on people's minds.
Yeah, and understandably so. And I think all options should be on the table. I do like the idea of a gap year. I think it has to be planned right. And there are a bunch of groups out there who plan really good educational gap years. And there are probably college counselors or the equivalent who can give advice to parents on designing the right gap year. You certainly do not want that gap year of the kid, sitting in the basement playing video games all day long, which is everybody's sort of worst image of what might happen. But if you can find an educational gap year, or at least find the expectation that they're going to hold a job, so that they have to maintain some responsibility. But I do think there are kids with ADHD out there who will probably an alternative to immediately jumping to college. It would be reasonable. Some of the things we recommend is have kids take 1 or 2 classes at a local community college and live at home so they can get their feet wet. They can find out what college is all about, but parents have a little more opportunity to monitor. Sometimes I had a parent recently, the kid was set on going to a particular college, and the mom was desperately worried that he's not going to make it. And I suggested that they come up with a behavior contract. Here's what he will do. Here's the grades they expect him to earn, because this is a very expensive proposition. Right. And I don't think that's something we should hand to kids. I think there's a feeling, they have an obligation to do something in exchange, and maybe even come up with that behavior contract. If this doesn't work out and we all accept it might not, here's plan B. Right.
That's great. Yeah. So we're all on board at the beginning that this is where this is going to go. Right.
Right.
Okay. So, so a lot of interesting questions about school, not surprisingly. 14-year-old boy with ADHD, very smart, but we can't get him to complete tasks that just don't interest him. He's not oppositional, but he just keeps saying he's going to do it, and it just doesn't happen. So that doesn't sound surprising, right?
No, it really doesn't. I guess, there are 2 ways to go with this. One of the things I recommend is when you have kids make a study plan. Have them make a plan with a start time, so at least they're going to start then. In terms of task completion, to me, that would be one thing where I would be saying, I would be looking at, do they have to complete everything? We have, again, I was a straight A student in school. So when my kids came along and suddenly they weren't doing all their homework, or they doing it sloppy, or they didn't care, I was like, what is this? I've never seen this before. So I sort of had to back off. And what I found from tracking kids is you don't have to produce the best quality homework. You don't even have to finish all of it. And still you can get relatively reasonable grades. So, we have this all or none expectation that kids should absolutely do every item on their math. But that may be something where we want to negotiate, especially with kids with ADHD. By the time they get home, first of all, they've put more energy into just surviving the school day than the typical kid does, just because they have to sit still for periods of time, and their brain doesn't want to do that. And second of all, their medication may be wearing off. So we're asking them to do very effortful work at a time when they are totally depleted. So to me, it makes some sense, either in negotiating with the kid, or having the kid negotiate with the teacher, or even having it built into a 504 plan. I mean, you don't want to wipe the homework off the face of the map, because kids you can learn a lot of executive skills by doing homework. But you also don't want to, sometimes I think we're sending these kids it must feel like a prison sentence to them for 4 years of going to school and coming home and sitting down doing homework and never doing anything else.
Yeah. One big problem that I'm sure, and this won't be the first time you've heard this, that people are raising is video games. So in addition to having a hard time starting, they have a hard time starting a task, having their child stop playing video games. And their question really is sort of, how do they manage, how should there be a limit on video games? How should they manage that?
Yeah, there should be a limit. And I'd recommend, for more information about this, I'd recommend a book called Screen Smart Parenting. I can't remember the author, but if you go to Amazon and type in Screen Smart Parenting, they give advice for managing technology with kids all the way from toddlers up to through high school. So look at that for guidance. I do think, and the research that's coming out now in terms of the impact of spending long hours on social media and its effect on school performance. Kids who spend an hour a day on social media do significantly better. Once kids spend 5 hours or more on social media per day, it has an extreme impact. You can see the impact on grades. So it's worth, in my house, if I were dealing with now, I'd probably figure out a way to block internet access, or block access to the video game sites or whatever after they'd reached a certain limit. One of the ways to handle the kid won't stop playing. So let's say you've made a deal with your kid that he did his math and now he gets to play a video game for 15 minutes and then he's going to do the next assignment as a break. So the video game ends up being a break between assignments. That continued use of that agreement only works as long as he gets off that game in the allotted time. So if on Monday, he drags it out and he's 30 minutes playing that game, then on Tuesday, there's no video games.
Right.
And he can earn it back on Wednesday so that he can learn. And that's the other thing about this. Whenever we're especially using technology, it has to be quick in and out. You can't just suddenly pull the video game system out of the kid's bedroom and he's never going to see it for 5 months. But if it's a quick in and out, you earn it on a daily basis, you lose it on a daily basis. That's one way to do it. The other way, and a way to give kids a little more control over it, is to ask a kid, how long can you go on your homework before you need a break and before you need to check your smartphone or do whatever it is. And then there are apps for that. Things like Pomodoro is one where you can set up a whole study schedule where the kid works for 25 minutes, gets 5-minute break, and when he's accumulated 4 of those, then he gets an hour break. So there are different ways of doing that, and it might be worth looking into those. All of these, though, work way better when you've negotiated them with your kid than when you're imposing them on your kid.
Right. Interestingly, here's someone who says, my daughter is very anxious, and she says spending time on the computer calms her down. So I feel bad taking it away from her. She's not doing social media. She's playing Minecraft. So it's so it's almost like a self-medication. So,
Sure.
you know,
Yeah. So again, and this is the other thing I tell parents too, because I had a parent say to me once, my kid makes the honor roll, but he's spending all his time playing video games. But when I say to him, this isn't right, he says, Mom, I made the honor roll. What's the big deal? I mean, I should be able to do what I want. And the response I give is, it's all about balance.
mm-hmm.
You need physical activity, you need social activity, and yeah, technology. And there's some good stuff. I mean, Minecraft's a great game. There's some good stuff that you can be doing with technology. But you don't want any one of those, and you could probably think of a couple other categories as well, to totally absorb the kid's time.
Yeah. That's the problem with media diet, I think, is that it sort of takes over from reading or athletics or other things that are developmentally good. Interesting number of questions from people who say something along these lines. How to handle differences between spouses. One says yes easily, and one is the bad guy and ends up saying no. Parent who understands ADHD and a parent who doesn't and blames it on defiance or laziness. So sort of basically parents differing in their approach to the problems that we're describing of executive functions. Yeah, it's tough.
Boy, that's tough. And I don't know how many presentations. I do a lot of parent presentations, and the moms always come, and then they tell me stories about the dads who didn't come. And by the way, I mean, let me just throw this out there. There are a couple of versions of the parent presentation that I do that you can access one at my website, smartbutscatteredkids.com, because I've had moms say to me, "Oh, great, now I can have my husband watch the videotape." I watch the YouTube video. It takes a little over an hour. Smartbutscatteredkids.com, and if you go to the media link and then look at, you'll be able to find it eventually. But it's just I did a presentation in Littleton, Massachusetts a couple of years ago, and they videotaped it for their local TV station and sent me a copy, so I posted it on my website. So that might be one thing. And I think whatever you can do to try to educate the spouse who seems to be a little more rigid about what's going on. I mean, I will admit, my husband and I agreed on a lot. He tended to be a little stricter than I was, and that actually worked for us, because there are times when some kids need a soft hand, and there's times when when kids need someone laying down the law. And so if neither one is too far in any one direction, in fact, that might be the way to start a conversation with one spouse, by saying, we bring different strengths to the parenting, and there are times when your approach I know works better than my approach, but there are times when I think my approach works better, and we just need you to learn to read our kid better. Because that's part of it, is how does the kid react? Are you getting the result you want?
Right. Gigi says, my spouse and I are not on the same page. One of us works down communication don't, and one of us works down communication do. But there you go. Let's see how we can both add value here. So question about transitions. One set of questions relate to the transition from middle school to high school, and another set about the transition from high school to college. Both groups looking for help on how to help their child make that transition. And in both cases, you know what it's going to be like, and the kid doesn't, and the kid probably either thinks it's going to be just fine or is petrified. I mean, both of those go on. I think casually having conversations in the weeks or months, like over the summer leading up to those transitions, certainly, from middle school to high school, if you can find one friendly person at high school, a guidance counselor, a teacher, a coach, or something, who will be willing to sit down with the kid, because they're going to listen to someone in the school more than they'll listen to you, or even an older student who would be able to say, here's what I wish I knew when I gone from eighth grade to high school. Someone to help kids understand what it's going to be like, and it's not the parent telling them that, because they're not going to listen to the parent. I think, and then the other, we haven't talked about the school's responsibility in all of this, but our general recommendation, especially from middle school to high school, any transition from one school to another, we recommend front-loading services, front-loading supports.
So building in a daily check-in with, the school guidance counselor, or the resource room teacher, or whoever in the first 3 months of school, and then fading it out after that. I think too often what schools would prefer to do is to wait until the kid falls apart and the parent is banging on the door, and then they'll say, grudgingly, okay, here's what we'll do. But if you've got a kid on either a 504 plan or an IEP, it would be worth building in some transition pieces to those documents, just to try to front load the supports.
Right. That makes huge sense. Well, we're almost out of time. This has been really great. Do you have any final words of advice for parents of teens struggling with motivation and executive function?
No, but I'll leave you with one quick story that was told to me by a mother last year. Now, admittedly, her daughter did not have an attention disorder, so this may not be applied at all, but I thought it was hilarious. Sometime in the beginning of her senior year, she said, "I can't follow you to college, so I'm not going to be checking in with you on your homework. It's up to you now." And she didn't. She left it, and the kid pulled herself up and did what she needed to get through high school, her senior year. Just before summer vacation, the mom said to her, "I'm not going to be at college with you to see what you're doing at night. So you know what? You have no curfew. All I ask that you do is to text me if you're going to be out all night." And I said to her, "Oh my God, were you like petrified?" She said, "Of course, I was terrified." But what her daughter did, interestingly enough, was without curfew, she started coming home earlier than she would have. And when she went to college, she told her mom later, the first 6 weeks I went wild. And then I just settled down because she'd had that taste of freedom already.
Right.
So again, there may be variations on that. With a kid with ADD, that might be not the best decisions to make, but it's something to think about. Can you give your kid a little rope so he can experience what it's like to take a few steps on their own?
Wow.
So that's what I'll leave you with.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This was super helpful.
Sure.
And again, thank you to Play Attention. And thanks to everybody for participating in Attitude webinars. We're really glad to have all your helpful questions and to have these wonderful experts that we do. So thanks all.
Take care.
Take care.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.